In the winter of 1941, the mood inside the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was one of electric, almost intoxicating triumph. The news from Pearl-Xarbor had arrived like a lightning bolt. The American Pacific Fleet was in ruins, smoke-filled hulls resting on the bottom of the Hawaiian mud. To the Japanese public, victory seemed not just possible, but destined. But behind the closed shoji doors of the High Command, a much darker, more sober conversation was beginning to take place. This was the era of the mirage of victory. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl-Xarbor attack, was a man haunted by his own success. While the streets of Tokyo were filled with lantern parades and cheering crowds, Yamamoto sat in his cabin aboard the battleship Nagato, staring at the vast expanse of the Pacific. He had lived in America. He had studied at Harvard and worked as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C. He knew something his colleagues in the Army refused to believe, that Japan had not killed the giant, they had only woken it up. Inside the War Ministry, General Hideki Tojo and his inner circle were drafting maps of what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. On these maps, Japanese influence stretched from the borders of India to the wake of the California coast. There was a seductive delusion taking hold, a belief that the American spirit was soft, that the decisive battle doctrine would force the United States to the negotiating table within 6 months. They imagined a scenario where a demoralized America would cede the Pacific and allow Japan to rule the East unchallenged. However, the mirage began to flicker almost immediately when the question of a mainland invasion was raised. In secret staff meetings, young, ambitious officers proposed daring landings in San Francisco or the seizure of the Panama Canal. But the logistics officers, the men who counted the barrels of oil and the tons of steel, began to present a terrifying reality. To land even a modest force on the west coast of the United States, Japan would need a transport fleet 5 times larger than what they possessed. They would have to protect a supply line 5,000 miles long against an enemy that was already beginning to rebuild. The Japanese intelligence services, the Tokubetsu Koto Keisatsu, began to intercept reports that dampened the celebratory mood. They saw American factories they had previously dismissed as inefficient, switching to wartime production with a terrifying speed. They realized that while Japan was a nation of craftsmen, America was a continent of machines. The mirage of victory was the brief window of time where Japan felt it could dictate terms to the world. It was the period where the decisive battle seemed like a strategic masterstroke rather than a desperate gamble. But as early as January 1942, the private diaries of high-ranking officials like Kido Koichi began to reflect a growing dread. They realized that the victory at Pearl-Xarbor had provided no strategic depth. Japan had gained territory, but they had lost the one thing they couldn't afford: time. This chapter of history is a study in the danger of overconfidence. The Japanese leaders had mistaken a tactical success for a total conquest. They had looked at the smoke over Hawaii and seen the end of the war, when in reality they were looking at the beginning of their own destruction. The mirage was beautiful, glowing with the promise of empire, but as the sun rose higher over the Pacific, it began to evaporate, revealing the cold, hard industrial wall of an America that was just getting started. By the spring of 1942, the high-ranking officers of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy began to realize that their greatest enemy wasn't the American soldier or the Pacific storms, it was the American factory.
While the Japanese public was still celebrating the fall of Singapore and the Philippines, a small, secretive group of analysts in Tokyo, the Total War Research Institute, was staring at a set of numbers that spelled certain doom. They were looking at the industrial wall, and for the first time, Japan's leaders admitted in private that they had challenged a power they could never outproduce. The realization hit like a physical blow. Japanese intelligence agents in South America and neutral European ports began sending back frantic reports on American industrial mobilization. They described the arsenal of democracy waking up. In Detroit, massive automobile plants like Ford and General Motors were not just making trucks, they were churning out B-24 Liberator bombers every 60 minutes. In the shipyards of California, Liberty ships were being launched in days, not months. One Japanese attaché noted with horror that for every single aircraft carrier Japan painstakingly built over 3 years, the United States was preparing to launch a dozen. Inside the halls of the Imperial General Headquarters, the atmosphere turned grim. Japan was a nation of master craftsmen, of hand-fitted parts and precision engineering. Their Mitsubishi Zero was a work of art, but it was a jewel that took thousands of man-hours to produce. America, by contrast, was a continent of machines. To the Japanese planners, the American method was soulless, but it was undeniably effective. They realized that the United States was treating the war like a mass production problem, turning out tanks, planes, and bullets with the same cold efficiency as cans of soup. A secret document circulated among the cabinet members comparing the raw resource output of the two nations. The statistics were staggering. America produced 10 times more steel than Japan. They had access to 20 times more oil. They had an electrical grid that could power 1,000 cities. One analyst famously whispered to his superior that fighting America was like a cup of water trying to extinguish a forest fire. Japan's leaders admitted that they had based their entire strategy on a short war because a long war against American industry was a mathematical impossibility. This was the moment the industrial wall became a psychological barrier for the Japanese high command. They realized that even if they won every battle, the Americans would simply build more ships and train more pilots than Japan could ever kill. The fear was no longer about a tactical defeat. It was about being crushed by the sheer weight of American steel. They saw the Atlantic Bridge, the endless convoy of supplies, and realized that the 5,000-mile distance they thought would protect them was actually a highway for American logistics. The industrial wall was the turning point in the minds of men like Admiral Yamamoto. He had warned his peers that he could run wild for 6 months, but after that he had no confidence. By mid-1942, those 6 months were up. The Japanese leaders had to face the bitter admission they had poked a sleeping giant that possessed the industrial heart of a titan. They were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting a desperate losing race against a factory-driven juggernaut that would eventually drown the rising sun in a sea of mass-produced fire.
In the summer of 1942, as the high water mark of Japanese expansion began to recede after the disaster at Midway, a group of elite strategic planners within the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo sat down with a set of topographical maps that they had once hoped would be blueprints for conquest. These were detailed charts of the American West Coast, California, Oregon, and Washington. But as they traced the contours of the land, the excitement of the previous year was replaced by a cold, sinking realization. They weren't looking at a target, they were looking at the fortress of geography. Japanese military doctrine had always relied on swift, decisive strikes in concentrated areas, the island-hopping campaigns of the South Pacific. But America was not an island, it was a continental titan. The planners realized that even if the Imperial Navy managed the impossible, a successful landing at a major port like San Francisco or San Pedro, their troubles would only just be beginning. The American shoreline was not a gateway, it was a massive natural trap. First, there was the sheer scale of the distance. To sustain an invasion force, Japan would have to maintain a 5,000-mile supply line across the world's largest ocean, a line constantly harassed by American submarines and long-range bombers. But the land itself was the true nightmare. Beyond the thin strip of coastal plains lay the Sierra Nevada and the Cascade Mountains, jagged, snow-capped walls of granite that reached over 14,000 feet into the sky. Japanese generals accustomed to the humid jungles of Asia looked at the maps of the American Mojave Desert and the Great Basin with a sense of dread. They realized that any invading army would have to cross thousands of miles of scorching salt flats and freezing mountain passes just to reach the industrial heartland of the Midwest. To conquer America, one intelligence officer reportedly admitted in a private memo, is to not defeat an army, but to swallow a continent. They calculated that to occupy just the 3 Pacific states, they would need an army of 5 million men, more than the entire Imperial Japanese Army possessed at the height of the war. And even then, they would be thousands of miles away from the centers of American power in Washington, D.C. and New York City. The American interior was a vacuum that would suck the life out of any invading force, stretching their resources until they snapped. The fortress of geography was a silent, immovable defender. The Japanese leaders admitted that the United States possessed a strategic depth that Japan simply could not comprehend. While Japan's cities were crowded and vulnerable to a single night of firebombing, America was vast, decentralized, and shielded by 2 massive oceans and a spine of impenetrable mountains. They realized that the United States was the only nation in the world that was truly, geographically, uninvadable. This admission was the final nail in the coffin of Japanese offensive strategy. The planners understood that America could lose its entire fleet at Perl-Xarbor and still be safe behind its mountain walls. They had challenged a power that lived in a fortress designed by nature itself. By late 1942, the maps of the California coast were folded away, and the talk of dictating peace in the White House was silenced. The hunters had realized that the cage they were trying to break into was actually a fortress they could never hope to breach.
As the strategic reality of the Pacific War shifted in late 1942, the Japanese High Command had to face a terrifying, unconventional factor that didn't appear on military tonnage charts or industrial output graphs. They called it the resistance of the masses, but history remembers it as the civilian shield. While Japanese planners were experts at calculating the strength of an opposing army, they were utterly baffled and eventually horrified by the unique nature of the American public. In secret intelligence dossiers compiled in Tokyo, Japanese leaders admitted a chilling truth. Even if they destroyed the U.S. Navy and bypassed the mountain fortresses, they would be forced to fight a nation where every house was a pillbox and every citizen was a potential sniper. The Japanese military culture was built on absolute hierarchy and civilian obedience to the emperor. They expected a conquered populace to submit once their professional army was defeated. But their intelligence reports from North America painted a very different picture. They looked at the vast rural expanses of the American Midwest and the rugged frontiers of the West, and saw a population that was not only fiercely individualistic, but also the most heavily armed civilian body on Earth. An internal report for the Imperial General Staff noted with grim fascination that, in America, marksmanship is a national pastime and the hunting of game is a rite of passage for the youth. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto is often credited with the legendary warning that to invade America would be to find a rifle behind every blade of grass. Whether he spoke those exact words or not, the sentiment was a documented pillar of Japanese strategic fear. They realized that unlike the colonial territories they had seized in Southeast Asia, where the locals were often indifferent to their European masters, the American civilian was emotionally and physically invested in the defense of their own soil. Japanese planners admitted that an occupation of the United States would not be a military administration. It would be a hell of 1,000 snipers. This civilian shield created a mathematical nightmare for the Japanese army. To occupy a hostile nation, a military typically needs a ratio of 1 soldier for every 20 civilians. In a nation of 130 million people, Japan would have needed an occupation force of over 6 million men, more than their entire global military strength, just to keep the peace in the streets. They envisioned a scenario where every supply truck would be ambushed by farmers, every city street would be a deadly maze of domestic resistance, and every mountain pass would be held by hunters who knew the terrain better than any map could show. In the private diaries of high-ranking officials like Kido Koichi, there's a growing admission that the American spirit was not the soft, decadent thing their propaganda claimed. They saw the Minuteman tradition, the idea of the citizen soldier, as a chaotic but lethal force. They realized that in America, the government didn't just have an army, the people were the army. This realization stripped away the last remnants of the short war theory. They understood that even a total naval victory would lead to a decades-long insurgency that would bleed the Japanese empire dry. The civilian shield was the ultimate deterrent. It was the realization that the United States was not just a government or a military, but a massive armed collective that could not be policed, let alone conquered. By 1943, this admission had shifted Japan's goal from victory to survival. They realized they had challenged a culture that viewed its personal liberty as a sacred right worth dying for, and they had no answer to 100 million rifles waiting behind 100 million blades of grass. By the autumn of 1944, the vibrant cherry blossoms of Tokyo had been replaced by the gray ash of firestorms, and the grand delusions of the Imperial High Command were finally being dismantled by the cold hammer of reality. This was the bitter admission, the final agonizing stage where the architects of the Pacific War stopped lying to themselves and looked into the abyss of their own creation. The dream of a negotiated peace, let alone an invasion of the American mainland, had evaporated, leaving behind only the stark certainty of total defeat. In the secret bunkers beneath the Imperial Palace, the Big Six, the Supreme Council for the direction of the war, met in suffocating silence. The propaganda machines were still screaming about divine winds and the certain victory of the 100 million Japanese people, but the internal documents told a different story. Prime Minister Kuniaki Koiso and Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo were now reviewing reports that admitted the United States was not just winning the war, they were reinventing it. The bitter admission was the recognition that Japan had lost the technological and logistics race years before. The most painful admission came from the logistics officers. They looked at the maps where Japanese outposts were being bypassed and starved on the vine by General MacArthur's leapfrogging strategy. They realized that while Japan was struggling to fuel a single battleship, the Americans were building floating cities, moving millions of tons of supplies across the ocean with an ease that seemed supernatural. Admiral Suwemu Toyota privately admitted that the Imperial Navy had ceased to exist as a functional fighting force. The great decisive battle they had prayed for since 1941 had happened at Leyte Gulf, and they had been annihilated. But the most profound psychological shift occurred when the leaders looked at the American B-29 Superfortress bombers appearing over Tokyo. These silver giants, flying at altitudes the Japanese fighters could barely reach, were the ultimate symbols of Japan's failure. The leaders admitted that their initial assessment of the American character had been tragically wrong. They had expected the Americans to be soft and materialistic, assuming they would sue for peace after a few bloody setbacks. Instead, they found a nation possessed by a grim industrial fury, a power that wouldn't stop until the Japanese Empire was erased from the map. In his private diaries, Kido Koichi, the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal and the Emperor's closest advisor, began to record the bitter admission of the Emperor himself. Hirohito began to ask his generals pointed, uncomfortable questions. Where are the aircraft you promised? Why are our defenses failing? The answers were always the same: silence and bowed heads. The High Command finally admitted that the plan to dictate peace terms in the White House was never a strategy. It was a mass hallucination used to justify a gamble they could never win. The bitter admission culminated in the summer of 1945. The leaders realized that the fortress of geography they once thought they could breach was now being used against them. America was no longer a distant target. It was a crushing weight leaning over their home islands. The realization was total. Japan hadn't just lost a war of soldiers, they had lost a war of civilizations, of factories, and of geography. The dream of empire ended not with a grand final battle on the shores of California, but with a quiet, bitter surrender in a radio broadcast that told a stunned nation they must endure the unendurable.